As promised, I told y'all never know about y'all girl Empress Goddess, the Georgia Peach. I got me a little rest today. I slept in. I usually don't sleep till no 10 o'clock. Not me. So got a little rest yesterday. I went live a couple of times yesterday. Went live today, but not like I usually been doing. Not just going back to back to back. I've been getting me some rest because my body was tired, my loves. But there's so much information that I tried to get out. Now, this is one. I purchased these audio books. I might as well go ahead and get my money out of them. This, my loves, we're gonna talk about sex. Sex and religion, well, rather sex and God, by Daryl Ray, ed.d. Author, How Religion Distorts Sexuality. I hadn't done any podcast any chapters here in the last couple of weeks, I don't believe. So I figured I'd go ahead and get a little bit of this on back out there. Once again, you all, my love, I do not own any copyrights to this content. This is for educational purposes under the Fair Use Act of 1976-107 for educational purposes, my love. Fair use, fair use. I may say it again. Now, without further ado, sex and God. How religion distorts sexuality. Why are all the major religions consumed with sex? What makes sex so important? Whether Buddhism or Islam, Christianity or Mormonism. What is the impact of religion on human sexuality? This book explores this and more. It ventures into territory that has never been examined. You will be surprised at how much religion has influenced your sexuality, who you marry, the pleasure you get or don't get from sex, and what you can do about it. My love, this is your girl, Empress Queen Goddess, the Georgia Peach with the sweet beat, coming back at you one more again. Always dropping gems, sex and God.
Don't tamper with the factory. Sex education, the biggest threat to religion. When should a person start having sex? Religious groups are pretty clear about this one. You should have sex only after you are married and only with the person you are married to. But what they profess and what they do are two different things.
Yeah.
Religion does
Hypocrites.
not stop adolescents from having sex. It only makes them feel bad about the sex they do have. If they feel guilty, they'll keep coming back to their church to get relief from the guilt their religion taught them. A decade of research shows that religiosity has little or no impact on the onset of sexual activity. From masturbation to petting to oral sex and intercourse, religious kids start about the same time as secular children. U.S. government research on abstinence-only programs comes to the same conclusion. Religious training delays sexual activity by months at best. Why do religions preach against sex before marriage? They say it is to prevent disease and pregnancy. Some try to convince teens that sex before marriage damages marriage later. Others say God says sex is sinful outside of marriage, and you will burn in hell for violating God's law. Mormons and Muslims say sex is a sacred possession of women that she gives only to her husband. These ideas inject guilt and shame into the young victim. Often, fact-based sex education is among the biggest threats to religion. Knowing the facts about sex reveals the myths that religions preach. That is why most religions oppose secular sex education. Sex education also raises very uncomfortable questions for religious parents. Thus, good sex education will reveal that most people, including one's parents, masturbate, have sex before marriage, experiment with same sex partners, fantasize, and use porn. The vast majority of religious parents had sex before marriage, yet preached abstinence loudly to their children. It is rare that parents ever let their child know that they were sexually active before marriage. Instead, they tell their children of the hazards and horrors of having sex too early, never addressing the obvious question: Mom or Dad, how did your premarital sex damage you as you claim it will do to me? If they ever answer that question, it's almost always in terms of religious guilt. Humans have had premarital sex for most of the existence of the species. No credible evidence shows that premarital sex has any negative impact on sexuality, marriage, or parenting ability. In Europe, the vast majority of teens have sex when they decide they're ready, and European civilization has not fallen apart. European parents generally don't threaten, kill, or beat their teenagers for engaging in sex. They educate their teens with some of the best sex education in the world. Teens are given the information to make their own rational decisions about when to begin sex. Adolescent sexual health outcomes are consistently better in France, Germany, the Netherlands, and other parts of Europe than in the United States. Life, a balancing act. Every life is a set of competing drives and goals. Achieving balance creates greater happiness and satisfaction. Sex requires balance as well. If one loses a sex partner, sexual feelings and behavior are disrupted. Eventually, sexual urges and desires will drive most people to do something about it. They may masturbate more, go out to places to meet possible partners, join an online dating service, etc. These behaviors are driven by natural sexual urges, so ignoring them is not an option for most people. Even those who say they can ignore or reduce their sex drive may not recognize it is being expressed in some other area of their lives. Having a good sex life with a loving, caring partner or partners helps reduce stress and allows us to be more productive and creative in other areas of our lives. It helps us create balance between our biological lives and our social and mental lives. Conversely, ignoring or distorting our biological map often leads to problems in our social and mental lives. Using this naturalistic philosophy as a baseline, let's look at how different religions distort sexuality away from our natural tendencies. Distortion of the Catholic priesthood. What did you know about sex before you started engaging in intercourse? That is the level of knowledge a priest has, unless he's cheating with another man or woman, or both. People don't learn about their sexuality from books or discussions. They learn mostly from personal experience in bed with themselves or someone else, the opposite of what a priest is taught to do. Even if a priest is actively engaged in sex, it is illicit by definition. What does secret, illicit sex teach you about sex and sexual relationships? When I was in clinical practice, I worked with two priests who came to me for counseling. In both cases, their stories were those of perfectly normal 13-year-old boys. They masturbated a lot and loved to use pornography. They did not mention any pedophile tendencies, but years later, one of them was arrested for just such behavior. In my few sessions with each of them, I could see nothing particularly wrong with their urges. What they were dealing with was an unnatural demand by their religion to forego a powerful drive, and as a result, they were suffering from guilt, angst, and depression. This experience helped me understand better the pedophile priest phenomena. If most priests are like the ones I worked with, as I've later come to learn is generally true, they are boys in men's bodies. Many are attracted to boys because that is the age at which their own development was arrested. It is the time at which their sexual map was formed. This is no excuse for the horrendous abuse that has been perpetuated by priests, but it does explain why the problem is so common and pervasive. It also points to the solution. Stop asking humans to act like eunuchs when they're not. Priestly misconduct is an example of religion distorting sexuality. It is like tying a young tree with a strong cord that pulls it hard in one direction and keeps tightening as the tree grows. The result will be a tree with a crooked trunk. As the cord bends the tree struggles to grow towards the sun. In the end, the trunk is bent at a very odd angle and cannot possibly support the weight it might have otherwise. Most priests and nuns are drawn into the ministry before their hormones kick in. They cannot possibly know how powerful their biology is. Their religious sexual map teaches them sex is a crime against their God, but their biological map drives them to want sex intensely. All they know is that they are damned for having normal feelings and wanting to act on them. Their education almost always starts when they are 12 or 13. Many who become priests or nuns attend same-sex seminaries or schools. They have little or no exposure to the opposite sex, and the celibate priests or nuns who instruct them are just as ignorant. Even if the boys are not abused by their instructor priests, they will probably engage in normal sexual behavior within their student group. The hormones are raging. What is a 15-year-old boy going to do if he is terrorized about masturbation and knows that sex with girls is a mortal sin? He will do what any normal boy does: experiment with boys around him, and then be torn with tremendous guilt. While other boys' brains are imprinting on normal sexual targets, like women's faces, breasts, butts, voices, etc., the future priest's brain is being bombarded with messages that create fear of sex. Any sex he has will generate huge amounts of guilt that then feeds back into the religious sexual map. It is a formula for a very twisted and immature understanding of one's sexuality. Combine this with the many other messages priests receive about being leaders of the church and moral models who give advice to those who are not as spiritually accomplished or advanced. The role they are given and the sexual feelings and drive they experience will almost inevitably lead to enormous internal conflict. Whether or not a given priest ever commits a crime against a child, the sexual map of such a person will be distorted simply because he's being forced to an unnatural sexuality. Celibacy is nothing if not abnormal. The human body and brain are not made for such programming. Whatever normal is, it does not include celibacy. This same pattern can be seen in nuns as well. In my career, I had the opportunity to work with 2 institutions with nuns. I interacted with dozens of nuns and observed that their level of understanding about human sexuality was little better than that of a young girl. A few nuns were academically trained in sexual issues and were excellent listeners, but their adherence to Catholic sexual doctrine left them with few tools to understand or help people. Black Protestant church distortion. Black women are the most religious group in America. At the same time, they have among the highest number of unplanned pregnancies and receive 35% of all abortions, yet comprise only 13% of the population. Polls show that blacks oppose abortion more fervently than any other group in the United States. Black Christianity is against homosexuality, masturbation, same-sex marriage, premarital sex, condom use, sex education, and much more. It is among the most sexually conservative religions in America. In an interview, the Black U.S. journalist and critic of religion, Jamila Bey, observed, despite such strict mores around appropriate sexual behavior, 73% of African American children in the United States are born to unmarried parents. So clearly, there is some disconnect that allows such strong adherents to fail to so obviously, yet somehow maintain that they are indeed truly faithful. End quote. The Black Protestant Church has avoided scrutiny for decades. Just like the Catholic Church, it holds itself above reproach, making it taboo to criticize it. Outsiders who criticize are accused of racism and members of the Black community who oppose the church suffer ostracism and worse. Black atheists who call out the church are vilified. In an excellent essay, The Invisibility of the Black Atheist, Raph White observes, quote, "It can be argued that in most African American communities, it is more acceptable to be a criminal who believes in God and goes to church on Sunday while selling drugs to kids all week than to be an atheist who has a good job, a good education, contributes to society, and supports his family. In these communities, you find more tolerance towards gangbangers, drug addicts, and prostitutes who pray to God for forgiveness than for honest, productive citizens who deny the existence of God. This, for me, is one of the most embarrassing elements of Black culture. Our zealous embracement of the God of our kidnappers, murderers, slave masters, and oppressors." End quote. The Black Protestant Church holds itself out as the savior of the community and bastion of Black culture. However, the truth is something quite different. The Black Church condemns all that is natural about sex and sexuality so effectively that it leaves church members with little or no useful information about their sexuality. The Black Church creates an impossible sexual map, then condemns anyone who does not adhere to that map. Black Christianity makes women the sexual gatekeeper, even more strongly than white Christianity. It is women who are held responsible for remaining pure. It is women who are condemned and shamed when they fail. The shame and guilt effectively drive women back into the church so they can gain forgiveness. 70% of Black church attendees are women. It is the guilt cycle writ large. According to Jamila Bay, quote, "This is actually advantageous and serves to further the religious tradition. When a young woman has a child out of wedlock, and that child is a girl, the mother can show her willingness to repent by more stringently enforcing the rules of sexual behavior on her daughter. Thus, to not permit a young girl easy opportunity to play at normal dating and sexual behaviors, a mother may show her piety more strongly by keeping her girl in church and drilling her to protect her chastity, even though her mother did not. This serves the church by keeping more women inside. The younger ones are pressured to not displease their mothers by rebelling." End quote. Black women and men are given a religious sexual map that requires sexual fidelity, monogamy, marriage, heterosexuality, and no sex before marriage, no masturbation, and no abortion. But their biological map takes them in an entirely different direction. The conflict between church teachings and natural desires results in guilt, shame, and anger. In 2008, an article from the Guttmaker Institute by Susan Cohen notes that Black women have 3 times the number of unintended pregnancies as white women, and 5 times the number of abortions. This remains true even when education and income are accounted for. She also notes that Black women are less likely to use birth control than white women, leaving them at risk for unintended pregnancies and needing abortion services. What Cohen does not say is that the likely reason for this difference is the sexual programming of the Black church. The Black Protestant church's map is so distorted that it undermines healthy sexual and interpersonal relationships before they can even get started. The result is low marriage rates, more abortions, persecution of gays, higher number of sexually transmitted infections, shame and ridicule over masturbation, and much more. The Black church's conservative message is similar to the white evangelical churches, and the results are similar. White evangelical churches are seeing a decrease in male attendance and an increase of out-of-wedlock births, sexually transmitted infections, and abortions. The highest number of abortions in the United States is in the most religious areas. These problems have nothing to do with race and everything to do with the distorted sexual messages these churches preach. Religious guilt causes people to deny their behavior, even as they engage in it. Guilt short circuits rational examination of behavior in favor of supernatural notions like evil and the temptation of Satan. Replace the black church's teachings on sex with factual knowledge about sex and sexuality, and many problems would be solved. Unplanned births would plummet, STIs would be eliminated, abortions would be dramatically reduced, homosexuality would be accepted, even celebrated, and stable relationships could be established based on effective communication. The black church is the problem, not the solution. You can take religion out of sex, but you cannot take sex out of the black church. Sexual condemnation and guilt are the cornerstones upon which it thrives. You may wonder, why isn't this the same for other churches, like the Catholics? Aren't they notorious for sexual restrictions and guilt? It is true of some Catholics, especially Hispanics in the United States, but many American-born Catholics have learned to ignore the church and its teachings. The drop in attendance and dramatic decrease in large families tells us that American-born Catholics are not buying the map that the Catholic Church is selling. Unfortunately, the black church's sexual map is still selling quite well. The fundamentalist distortion. Baptists, or Seventh-day Adventists, Pentecostals, Nazarenes, Evangelical, and Jehovah's Witnesses are all shades of Christian fundamentalism. As such, their sexual views are universally restricted. All are opposed to homosexuality, premarital sex, masturbation, and many forms of sexual expression within marriage, such as anal and oral sex. While some of these churches are less vociferous than others, none is sex positive or offers a view of sexuality that resembles what human nature really is. Austin Klein, in his Atheism newsletter, articulated the distorted logic that comes from many fundamental religions and the Catholic Church. I quote, "Conservative evangelical objections to contraception, emergency contraception, and even abortion can often be traced, at least in part, to their objections to irresponsible sexual activity. Attempts to avoid pregnancy are thus attempts to avoid the consequences of one's irresponsible choices. Since avoiding the consequences of irresponsible choices is itself irresponsible, as well as something which makes such choices easier, it follows that people should be forced to bear those consequences. When it comes to sexual activity, this includes women accepting pregnancy," end quote. By this convoluted logic, pregnancy is a punishment resulting from having sex outside marriage. The goal is to get women to just say no to any sex that is not approved by their church, and to judge them as immoral. They say yes and use birth control. Groups like Rick Warren's Saddleback Church use the same logic when they offer support to churches in Africa. They preach for abstinence only and against condom use in areas with the highest number of AIDS victims. The result is a resurgence in AIDS in Central Africa, especially Uganda. Uganda had one of the most effective anti-AIDS programs in Africa and saw a steady decline in the disease until Christian fundamentalists began preaching against condoms. It is a good example of the God virus and the AIDS virus working together to infect people. The evangelical anti-homosexuality message is incredibly destructive to people in Africa. Rick Warren and others encouraged anti-gay legislation in Uganda. The hatred and religious fervor the evangelicals fostered may have been related to several attacks on homosexuals and the murder of David Kato, a gay rights leader. The sexual map of these churches leads to repression and subsequent acting out, not least among the clergy.
Big Chief, you still in here? You're not a moderator for nothing. Handle that.
Thus, all of these churches have problems controlling the clergy. Powerful, charismatic preachers can also be very sexually attractive. This presents many opportunities for the successful preacher. get a sample of this problem, visit the website stopbaptistpredators.org, an organization that's been documenting Baptist clergy sexual misconduct for years. Their investigations have shown cover-ups and behavior remarkably similar to those of the Catholic Church. Other churches are equally culpable, but no one has yet publicly stepped up to investigate all of them. The preachers who have been caught and those who help cover up the crimes and misbehavior preach regularly about sexual sin. The guilt and shame they preach flow constantly from their literature, church services, and Sunday schools. Church-led sex education teaches only abstinence. Children are miseducated and deceived about their bodies and desires. At the same time, as mentioned earlier, the youth of these churches have the highest rate of teen pregnancies and STIs. Homosexual children in the churches are subjected to persecution by the church and terror by their own parents. It is not surprising that homosexual children raised in conservative communities also have the highest suicide rate. Fundamentalist sexual distortion that leads to suicide can only be characterized as the worst of all distortions. Were there better research on the subject, we would probably find that churches that program children to hate or fear sex push a significant number to behave in self-destructive ways, including suicide. The Mormon distortion. Mormons are also against masturbation. They know it's going to happen, but they dare not say it's okay, because Jesus said that to even have lustful thoughts is a sin. The leaders also know that they've done it many times in their own life.
Who this is? Democrat. He's talking about the church. Because first of all, over here on my platform, I talk about the truth. I give the truth behind the meaning of the so-called gospel, the Bible, the King James, or whoever else wrote it. Because it ain't nothing but a bunch of symbolisms and allegories. We Christ conscious over here. We believe in the third eye. We believe in consciousness over here. Because the kingdom of heaven is within, my love. But you're free to have your opinions.
Life. Yet they cannot admit it. Instead, they talk around it, ignore it, or just give inane advice to not do it. One of the most humorous documents I've seen on the subject comes from Boyd K. Packer, who held some of the highest positions in the Mormon Church, including president of the Quorum of 12. In his 6-page
he's basically talking about the hypocrisy of the church. See, that's the point he's trying to get over. How they preach certain things, but they don't live by it. See, that's the point he really trying to get over. Y'all preach one thing, but it's an agenda behind everything you preach.
Instruction to young men only. He never uses the term masturbation or sex once. This would be hilarious if it weren't the actual view of the church. Here's an excerpt. It's a rather long quote, but stay with me here. It's good for laughs. I wish to explain something that will help you understand your young manhood and help you develop control. When this power begins to form, it might be likened to having a little factory in your body, one designed to produce the product that can generate life. This little factory moves quietly into operation as a normal and expected pattern of growth and begins to produce the life-giving substance. It will do so perhaps as long as you live. It works very slowly. That is the way it should be. For the most part, until you tamper with it, you will hardly be aware that it is working at all. As you move closer to manhood, this little factory will sometimes produce an oversupply of this substance.
Wow.
The Lord has provided a way for that to be released.
See that
it will happen without any help and without any resistance from you. Perhaps One night you will have a dream. In the course of it, the release valve that controls the factory will open and release all that is excess. The factory and automatic release work on their own schedule. The Lord intended it to be that way.
Wow.
It is to regulate itself. This will not happen very often. You may go a longer period of time, and there will be no need for this to occur. When it does, you should not feel guilty. It is the nature of young manhood and part of becoming a man. This, however, is something you should not do. Sometimes a young man does not understand. Perhaps he is encouraged by otherwise or unworthy companions to tamper with the factory. He might fondle himself and open that release valve. This you shouldn't do. For if you do that, the little factory will speed up, and you'll then be tempted again and again to release it. You can quickly be subjected to a habit, one that is not worthy, one that will leave you feeling depressed and feeling guilty. Resist that temptation. Do not be guilty of tampering or playing with this sacred power of creation. Keep it in reserve for the time when it can be righteously employed. End quote. Many fundamentalist churches would probably agree with most of these ideas. This is an attempt to ensure that young Mormon boys feel shame and guilt about their normal sexual urges. Don't tamper with the factory. Simple but ineffective message. This is a small sample of religions. A whole book could be devoted to the unique distortions of each cult and denomination. But this will suffice to illustrate the devastating impact of religion on the sex practices and sexuality of millions of people. Next, we will take a look at what happens when people leave religion, and religion is no longer in the bedroom. Chapter 16. What happens when you leave religion? Now, here's a little note to you who are listening. This is a summary of a rather large survey research that we did in 2012. And if you'd like to download the entire version, you can go to ipcpress.com. Otherwise, this is a very brief summary of a fairly long research report, all of which was fascinating. So let's begin. The guilt cycle and various denominations. In doing research for this book, I found few authors directly addressing religion's impact on sexuality and what happens to sex and sexuality when a person leaves religion. As a result, I determined to take a look myself. Amanda Brown, undergraduate at University of Kansas, and I conducted an internet-based survey of 14,560 secular people in the United States. Most of our respondents were born and raised in a religious environment, but have since left religion. We examined sex and religion from many different angles. We were most interested in the sexual guilt that people were taught or experienced in their religious training and how their sexual behavior changed once they left religion. We asked, how would you rate what you were taught, how guilty you felt about sex and its implications on yourself? We tabulated the results by the denomination in which the respondents were raised. In Figure 1, it shows that the fundamentalist religions use guilt more than liberal religions. It's not a surprise, but it's the first time that such data has been collected. In the graph, we can see that Mormons, Jehovah's Witnesses, Pentecostals, and Seventh-day Adventists were the top most sexually guilty religions in our survey. The least sexually guilty were Unitarians, Jews, agnostics, atheists, Buddhists, etc. We went on to hypothesize that higher guilt led to poorer communication between parent and child about sex. To measure this, we asked respondents where they had received their sex education. A total of 38.2% of those from the least religious homes said that they got sex education from their parents, whereas only 13.5% of respondents from more fundamentalist homes received parental sex education. In other words, Those from the most guilt-based religions received the least amount of information from their parents. Equally interesting were other sources of sexual information. For example, pornography was an important source of sexual information for 25.2% of the least religious, but the most religious cited as important 33% of the time. This is part of a pattern that shows most religious people often do the very thing that religion tells them not to, and they frequently do it at a higher rate than their more secular peers. Spanking the monkey. Since masturbation is discouraged among many religions, we asked questions about how respondents' parents treated masturbation in the home. We asked, were you shamed or ridiculed by a parent or guardian for masturbatory activities? A total of 5.5% of those from the most liberal homes said yes, while 22.5% of those from the most religious homes said yes. For most questions, we also allowed respondents to make comments. Some of these responses from people raised in religious homes were heartbreaking. Here's some examples. Being caught masturbating caused me to be beaten until I couldn't stand up. Another example. I used to masturbate and then perform the Islamic ritual cleansing and beg Allah for forgiveness. I tried to stop, but my sexual desire was worse when I didn't than when I did. I worried not only about sin, but also about the fact that my mother told me that if I masturbated, I'd have problems with my future husband. Those raised in non-religious homes made comments that were very different, even funny. Here's some examples. My mom found my porn at one point. She informed me she didn't approve and kindly asked me to remove it from her hard drive and put it on my own portable drive if I felt I needed to. Another said, not shame exactly, but scolded for absconding with Dad's Playboy and Penthouse magazines. Another said, my older sisters and their boyfriends would constantly ask, do you play with yourself? Heck yeah, I said, every chance I had. Early sexual experience. We looked at the beginning of sexual behavior in adolescence and found remarkable similarities in 4 types of behavior, regardless of childhood religious training. These included masturbation, petting, oral sex, and intercourse. As illustrated in Figure 2, there is very little difference in the beginning of these behaviors between those raised the most and least religious. At about age 18, the largest difference appears, but it's only 9% for intercourse, and that difference shrinks to 3.9% at age 21. All the sexual messages and guilt taught by religion have little or no effect on actual behavior. While this is just one study, we were careful to examine other studies that looked at similar behavior. For example, the National Abstinence-Only Research, funded by the federal government, found that teaching children to abstain from sex has almost no effect on actual behavior. Lusting in your heart. Christian religions teach that even fantasizing is sinful. So we asked respondents if they felt it was wrong to fantasize sexually about others. A total of 46.1% of those raised most religious said it was wrong, compared to 6.2% of the least religious. We also asked, when you were religious, did you believe it was wrong to discuss or act out fantasies with your partner? A total of 40% of the most religious said yes, compared to 3.9% of the least religious. Talk dirty to me. Good sexual communication between partners includes the ability to share fantasies and other sexual ideas and desires. We can see from these data that respondents raised in more religious families were far more reluctant to communicate fantasies with their partners and spouses than the less religious. According to some religious leaders, sharing fantasies is sinful for both partners. Evangelicals take the lust in your heart idea very seriously. This is evidence that religious people communicate far less about sex than the less religious. Sex after religion.
Come on, fam. Y'all need to get them light buttons up for your girl. Y'all back there in the back of this back there. Eavesdropping and ear hustling. Hit that like button. It ain't gonna cost you nothing.
We also asked, how has your sex life changed since leaving religion? As reflected in Figure 3, the difference was remarkable. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 as the most improved, 54.6% rated an 8, 9, or a 10. The comments we received tell a story of great relief and satisfaction. Here are some quotes. I became comfortable with the idea of being a girl who actively wanted to have sex. I didn't know that was possible. I have sex more frequently. I'm less inhibited. I felt more free to experiment and explore my sexuality. Another said, less embarrassment, more willing to act out fantasies, more comfortable and open about my own sexuality. Yet another said, I find that my wife and I are less inhibited. We talk more openly about sex and regard it now not as something merely for procreation, but for enjoyment and growing closer together. And finally, I am more open to new things. I don't feel guilty about getting myself off, watching porn, or needing to have sex. I enjoy sex, guilt-free. We found that only 2.2% said their sex life worsened after leaving religion. Leaving religion disrupted some marital relationships. Others found that they had reduced access to possible partners. Here's some quotes. Since leaving religion, I have not had a physical or emotional relationship with my wife. Another said, since becoming an atheist, I have not met anyone who does not have some religious or spiritual belief system. As a result, life is very lonely. I'm proactively meeting new single members of the opposite sex in an effort to find someone who does not believe in the supernatural. Another said, I used to be able to bed every girl in the Sunday school class. Now they won't talk to me. Using the denominational information, we were able to see how much difference there was in sexual satisfaction depending on former religious affiliation. Figure 4 shows how much sex life has changed. Sex improved for those leaving the most conservative and sexually repressive denominations, but every group showed some improvement. Residual effects. We hypothesized that guilt-based religious upbringing would have lasting or residual effects on people after leaving religion. Surprisingly, our data showed that sexual satisfaction was hardly impacted. In other words, those raised in the most restricted religious environments rapidly caught up with everyone else after leaving religion. It seems the guilt messages don't stick around very long. At the same time, there was a difference felt between the most and the least religious groups in terms of anger they still feel about their religion.
And you know, by me being a preacher's kid, they always said that we was the ones that was getting it in.
Just training. In response to the question, how much anger do you experience towards religion because of how it affected your sexuality? The average rating among the most religious was 4.2, 10 being the highest, while those from the least religious background scored a 1.83. Among the most religious, 23% scored their anger at 8, 9, or a 10, while only 4.3% among the least religious experienced high anger. As we can see from these results, some are still angry, but it does not seem to impact their current level of satisfaction. Lessons from the research. While we were pleased that our results were consistent with major national studies in areas like first onset of adolescent sexual activities, none of those studies looked at what role religion may play in creating sexual behaviors. Religion has injected itself deeply into human sexuality. It's time to put it under the microscope and document the impact. While much more needs to be done to understand how religion impacts sexuality, here are some conclusions to be drawn from this work. Number 1, religions that use guilt the most also interfere and damage sexual satisfaction the most. Less guilt-based religions do not impact sexual satisfaction as much. Second, If you marry or wish to marry a religious person, make sure he or she belongs to a low guilt religion like Unitarian, Episcopalian, or some forms of Judaism. Your sex life will be less impacted. Third, the best thing you can do for your sex life is leave religion, especially if you're in a high guilt group like Mormon, Pentecostal, Jehovah's Witness, Seventh-day Adventist, or Baptist. Number 4, childhood and adolescent religious sexual training has little effect on sexual behavior. Adolescents begin sexual activity about the same time, regardless of prior religious training. The danger is that religious children have not been given accurate information and may engage in more risky behavior, leading to higher unwanted pregnancies, STIs, and abortions among the most religious. Number 5, while secular parents are 3 times better at talking with their children about sex, it's still far too low at 38%. There is much room for improvement. In the next chapter, we will explore some of the underlying psychological and biological reasons why sex is so compelling and why religion has so little impact on the behavior. Chapter 17, Relationship Cycles. Relationships have cycles that are related to our biology. Recognizing the biological basis of our cycles allows us to make rational choices and create greater happiness and commitment in our relationships. New relationship energy, or NRE. If we're trying to understand the mating and bonding behavior of gibbons, we would take into account all aspects of behavior, as well as brain chemical and neurological functioning. Our biology and chemistry is based on the same genetics and evolutionary history as the other great apes and other primates. Yet, religion paints us as non-animal spiritual beings that are somehow disconnected from our biology. This fallacy prevents examination of what we really are and why we may behave in certain ways. Many religionists and romantics believe that understanding our biology and psychology detracts from sexual enjoyment. This myth allows religion to keep people ignorant and dependent upon Bronze Age ideas of sexuality. When people begin a sexual relationship, they experience the rush of endorphins, opiate-like chemicals in their brains that makes them feel euphoric. Some have called this new relationship energy, or NRE. Anyone who has been in love knows the feeling of new love. Art and literature are filled with stories of people like Romeo and Juliet in the throes of NRE.
That salt off, huh?
People want the sense of well-being and euphoria that comes from interaction with their lover. NRE is an incredibly powerful part of our species' reproductive strategy. As an important first step in the bonding process, it lasts a limited time and then either dissolves or evolves into a second type of long-term bonding. Long-term bonding is dependent on another set of chemical and neurological processes that generate very different feelings from NRE. We will call this long-term security, or LTS, and we'll discuss it in detail in chapter 23. Briefly, LTS is when people feel satisfied and secure in a relationship. Unlike the powerful emotions of NRE, LTS feels solid and reliable.
I'm always bringing some
The
gems
fact
over
that
here.
NRE can be almost uncontrollable is frightening to parents and religious leaders. Thus, all the major religions fear and condemn NRE. Some religions try to prevent it from happening. For example, arranged marriages effectively prevent NRE from undermining social, religious, political, and familial order. Most major religions have been involved in and supportive of arranged marriages at some time in their history. The practice allows for careful selection of socially or politically advantageous in-laws, thus ensuring that the religion is propagated as well. While arranged marriages are less common today, taboos against marrying outside one's religion are still enforced in most cultures. Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, among others, work to ensure young people marry within the religion. This is designed to prevent people from falling in love and diluting religious control over the offspring. In India, no Hindu father would select a Muslim husband for his daughter. An Orthodox Jew would never consider marrying a Christian. If a Christian married a Muslim in the United States, both families would likely disapprove. In modern U.S. Christianity, all...
You said you got me, no lie? Okay. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button. You said you gotta let them to kiss the barrel of the tech, kind of like Webby say.
All conservative religions preach against succumbing to the passions of youth. Abstinence-only courses focus on helping youth avoid the pitfalls of sex before marriage. None of this training works, and it sets the youth up for failure and guilt that will keep them tied to the church. Educating children on the entire spectrum of sexuality, including realistic ideas about NRE, would prevent many unwanted pregnancies, diseases, and divorces. Unfortunately, the church's motivation is not prevention through education, but guilt induction for religious propagation. Attachment. After NRE ends, humans may transition to attachment or long-term security. The easy, comfortable feeling a person can achieve with a long-time partner. The brain uses the same pathways for adult attachment it used in childhood attachment to parents. The chemistry of attachment uses the brain chemical oxytocin to create the feeling of well-being. Same chemical is released during orgasm, breastfeeding, and other intimate encounters. It bonds married couples, best friends, and pets. That is why some people feel so strongly about their pets. All objects of attachment evoke similar neural pathways and chemistry in our brain. Oxytocin makes us feel safe, trusting, and comfortable. It is an important part of the cycle of attachment. If the sex is adequate for both parties, the relationship can settle at this level for decades, if not a lifetime. If the sex is not adequate for one party, the relationship may appear settled, but that party may seek outside stimulation. The attachment may still be strong, but the need for stimulation and variety is not being satisfied. The unwritten rules of marriage. A marriage contract is surrounded by cultural norms and expectations. Some are unwritten, others have been put into law, like only one spouse per person, or no sex outside of this legally sanctioned marriage. Religious marriages may be subject to additional rules, such as no birth control. The woman is under divine obligation to keep her husband satisfied, except when she's pregnant. The man is the head of the house. There are also a host of other unwritten rules. For example, you cannot lust after another person. You may not masturbate while married. You may not think about other people while having sex with your spouse. You may not talk about sexual topics to a person you are not married to. Another unwritten rule is that one partner has full control over the other partner's sexual expression. The ultimate expression of control is when one spouse decides he or she doesn't want sex anymore. In other words, involuntary celibacy is imposed by one spouse on the other. This kind of celibacy is quite common among religious couples or couples where one is religious and the other is not. If one partner decides he or she does not want to be sexually active, religious ideas about sex and marriage preclude a rational discussion of the issue. I was once the guest co-host on the Atheist Experience TV show. The subject was sex and religion. Rich Lyons from Seattle called in and told us he'd been a Pentecostal minister for 20 years. He'd been married for 21 years, and he and his wife had had sex only 12 times during their marriage due to religious guilt and inhibition. He went on to say that during those 20 years, virtually every male member of his congregation came to him for counseling about their wives' lack of interest in sex. The only thing he knew to suggest was to have them pray with him. In his words, that did a little good. Women have a sex drive and capacity for sex that is equal to or greater than that of men. What could possibly have happened to a whole congregation of married Pentecostal women to tamp down that powerful drive and make them not want to have sex with their husbands? Guilt around sex often preys upon one partner more than the other. Once childbearing is over, the justification for sex is gone. As a result, the most guilt-ridden partner often decides it's easier to go without sex than to deal with the guilt associated with it. The natural aging process may also mean that one partner has less of a sex drive than the other. Less drive combined with more guilt makes it easy to refuse sex. The other partner may still have a strong sex drive, but nowhere and no way to express it. The very religious state of Utah has consistently had the highest consumption of pornography. In addition, porn use in the United States is generally higher in the most religious zip codes. This points towards the notion that sexual energy has to go somewhere, despite strong religious teachings and sanctions. While religious guilt does not explain all sexual dysfunction within a marriage, it explains a large proportion. Issues often have roots in religious dogma taught in childhood and adolescence. For example, a man or woman may be turned off by oral sex. If asked, they may say, "I just don't feel comfortable with it." All too often, a Sunday school teacher or minister told them it was dirty and unnatural. When children are starting puberty, they're extremely susceptible to religious messages. In my research, I encountered hundreds of stories about people being warned about eternal damnation for certain sexual activities. These messages often come from trusted adults, and the children carried them into adulthood and marriage. How does a woman relax and enjoy a good oral sex orgasm with her husband when she believes that it is an act only Satan himself could teach? Satiation, or "not tonight, honey, I have a headache." If you were forced to eat your favorite dessert every day for the rest of your life, you would probably be sick of it within weeks. Sex is similar. We need stimulation and variety. Children quickly tire of playing with the same toy and want new things. Most will go out of their way to invent new games. The same is true of adults and sex. Sooner or later, new relationship energy comes to an end. The novelty wears off. The excitement is less frequent or gone. At that point, the bond that holds a couple together must transition to something more settled, or they may break up. This is probably why the highest divorce rate is around 4 years of marriage, the maximum length of NRE. If they make the transition, sex may continue, but at a lower level. It may taper off over the next decade or two, as it becomes harder and harder for the partners to stimulate one another. It doesn't mean the sex drive goes away. They just have a harder time directing it towards each other. What would a couple look like and act like if they were members of the Hadza or Na culture? In all probability, they wouldn't stress over a lifelong marriage. Each of the partners would have several long-term relationships over a lifetime. The children would still get great care and teaching from aunts and uncles and others in the village. Relationship cycle. Religious notions of fidelity in marriage do not hold up to cultural and biological scrutiny. The basis for monogamy is rooted in the need for agriculturalists to control labor and inheritance. At the same time, religion takes advantage of this agricultural necessity to ensure that it is passed on to subsequent generations. The farther our society gets from agriculture, the fewer economic restrictions on women. This, in turn, weakens religion's ability to propagate through sexual rules and guilt, focused on the submission of women. With more economic and educational options for women, we may be seeing the natural course of biology take place. Just as many hunter-gatherer women have significant independence within their tribal culture, modern women have more power to decide who, when, and whether to marry. This does not mean that lifelong relationships are not possible, even desirable. It does mean that we should recognize the nature of love and attraction in humans. It is normal to get tired of your mate and desire someone else. The question is, what do you do about it? The current religious model for marriage allows no path for discussing attraction issues. As a result, people may feel trapped, unloved, and angry. These unexpressed feelings often are acted out in destructive ways, like becoming hypercritical of one another, undermining the financial security of their relationship, or having an affair. Eliminate religious ideas of marriage and monogamy, and many options open up. A couple can talk openly about what they like and want, what would stimulate them and give them more satisfaction. They can also discuss and explore issues of insecurity, inadequacy, and jealousy that are typically ignored or suppressed. Ignoring these slowly undermines the relationship.
Yeah, I'm sorry about the noise. I'm trying to fix me a little snack.
It's never easy to talk about these things, but the practice of doing it strengthens relationship and keeps it alive. Through these discussions, profound love can develop. Love that goes far beyond NRE. It still has the power to evoke NRE chemistry. We will explore this further in Section 5 and develop some practical ways to manage the relationship cycle. Chapter 18. Mommy, did you have sex before you married Daddy? Why are religious parents poor at sex education? What inhibits and prevents them from being honest with their children? Sexual guilt in marriage and child rearing creates problems for everyone. Children, parents, and sex. Rarely can parents talk easily and intelligently to their children about sex. Moreover, rarely do children want to talk about sex with their parents. As a result, even the most well-intentioned, best educated parent has great difficulty with the conversation. The problem is often quite simple: deeply ingrained religious guilt. In his research on adolescence and sexual communication with parents, Mark Regnerus reports in his book Forbidden Fruit, 2007, parents for whom religion is important communicate less often about birth control than parents whose religious faith is not important. This suggests that when devoutly religious parents say they are talking regularly with their adolescents about sex and birth control, it means they're talking with them about morality rather than sharing information. End quote. In our own research discussed in Chapter 16, we also found that religious children got more of their information about sex from experience, peers, and porn than from their parents. 13% of religious parents talk to their children about sex compared to 38% of secular parents. According to thousands of survey respondents, religious parents are much poorer than non-religious parents at talking about sex. Something is interfering with the communication, and religious guilt is the probable cause. Religious guilt around premarital sex may be one possible inhibitor. 95% of the U.S. population has had premarital sex, even religious people. The religious taboo against premarital sex is so strong that religious people cannot admit to this, especially to their children. This creates a barrier to communication between parent and child. As one religious parent told me, "What if my daughter asks if I had sex before marriage? Do I lie to her? Do I tell her no? Or do I tell her I did, but she shouldn't do it? How do I justify my behavior to my daughter? It's just easier not to talk about it at all." End quote. There's also the possibility that one or both of the parents have deceived the other partner about having premarital sex. This creates further guilt and conflict. If religious parents admit they could not resist premarital sex, how can they ask their children to resist it? The answer seems to be better to lie or not talk about it. More secular or religiously liberal parents do not face this dilemma. They openly talk about sex and premarital sex. They don't have to justify their behavior to their children because they don't see the behavior as wrong or sinful. As a result, secular parents tend to give their children better sex education. Religious parents see honesty about normal human sexuality as too risky. Therefore, they talk less to their children, give them less accurate information. This failure to communicate important, rational, and emotional information leaves religious children more at risk than those in secular homes. The irony is that what religious parents most fear and preach against, premarital sex or unwanted pregnancy, is more likely to happen with their children than with secular kids. Guilt doesn't stop anyone, but it does inhibit clear thinking.
Sex negative messages to girls. Fathers, teach your daughters to say no until they're married. Mothers, teach your daughters how devastating premarital sex will be in their marriage. This is the message propagated by patriarchal religions the world over. In religion, women are seen as the sexual gatekeepers, yet they are subordinate to their husbands. If a couple has sex before marriage, it is the woman's fault. She should have the moral power to say no and to save herself for her husband. This message is present in Islam, Catholicism, Hinduism, Mormonism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Buddhism, and many other religions. The notion that a woman's sexuality belongs only to the husband is a central tenet tied to the idea that a woman is the property of the father first, then the property of the husband. Incidentally, that is where Christians get the tradition of the father giving the bride away. Messages to keep girls chaste are always accompanied by fear and guilt. Girls are taught sex is dirty and sinful. Women are taught that it is their responsibility to control the sexual relationship. If they are given the message that sex is dirty and sinful, and women are the cause of the fall of man, it is no wonder that many women go into marriage horrified of sex and unprepared, except to say no. Here's an example of such married guilt. I was an agnostic atheist, forced to convert to an extreme evangelical Christian faith in order to marry my wife, whom I recently separated from. She was a 30-year-old virgin when we married, and her prolonged abstinence wreaked havoc in the bedroom from the very beginning. We refrained from any kind of sexual activity while we were dating and engaged, and unfortunately, we were unable to consummate our marriage on our wedding night. When we were dating and engaged and practicing purity, I was promised and guaranteed that our sex life would be greatly rewarded by God, and I bought into it. In fact, we didn't actually have what could be considered sex for over 2 weeks after we got married. When we did start having sex regularly, it was extremely awkward, and I could tell that the guilt and shame placed upon sex and normal human sexuality when my wife was growing up was holding her back from thoroughly enjoying life's greatest pleasure. The wife in this story was the victim of horrendous sexual programming by her evangelical religion. With this kind of childhood religious programming, many religious marriages are sexually dead from the start. The power of oblique communication. The major religions give powerful negative messages to women. The woman does most of the child rearing in patriarchal societies, so it is important for religion to infect her with guilt-inducing sexual ideas that ensure that children absorb the guilt as well. How are these messages conveyed to children, especially girls? The messages are conveyed through oblique or indirect communication. Women's gossip within hearing of young girls is a particularly effective way of conveying such messages. Children love to listen to adults as they gossip and take in the stories they hear as lessons on how to live your life. What if a girl overheard a comment like, "Mrs. X caught her daughter playing with herself. They're going to send her off to a special religious camp this summer so she will learn the fear of God." The eavesdropping child will quickly pick up the meaning and tone of the communication, and it integrates it into her sexual map. It's hard to miss the message that masturbation can get you in serious trouble. This kind of cloaked, gossipy talk often substitute for direct communication and information the child needs. Many parents and adults do this intentionally. Such quiet secretiveness, harsh judgment, and often embarrassed tone communicates volumes to a child about the sinfulness of sex and the treatment you can expect if you're caught doing it. I've heard from dozens of women who are raised in deeply religious homes, and the pattern is remarkably similar. Menstruation is another aspect of life that the religious label as shameful and dirty. Here's one woman's story, told as I was counseling her and her husband. My mom never told me about menstruation. I knew she used tampons, and as a little girl, I asked her about them. Her response was curt and clearly let me know it was not something I was to ask about again. I knew there was blood involved, and it scared me because I thought my mother was hurt. The most I could find out was that it had something to do with sex. When I realized what sex was, that really freaked me out. I thought, you mean I'll bleed if I have sex? I lived with this fear and uncertainty for as early as I can remember to about 10 years old. At that time, the older girls in my religious school started talking about things. Some were obviously breasts and talking about boys. I liked to listen, but I could never understand what was the truth and what were their own ideas. If I got up the courage to ask one of them, I got vague or conflicting answers. At about 12 years old, I remember playing with myself occasionally. It felt so good, but somehow I knew it was wrong. Touching myself gave me many sensations I had not felt before, but I always felt terrible afterward. When I was about 12 and a half, I was at school one day and suddenly got really nauseous and creepy feeling. I excused myself to go to the restroom and discovered that I was bleeding. I went crazy, became hysterical, and started crying in the stall. Someone heard me and tried to talk to me, but I was horrified that they would find out I was bleeding, horrified that I had done something terribly wrong and that someone would find out I'd been playing with myself. When someone finally got the door open and figured out what was happening with me, they laughed at me, then scolded me for trying to hide it and not knowing what it was. When I got home that day, my mother already knew. She was derisive and cold. Her only comment was something like, "You should have known how to handle it. We talked about it years ago." I felt like a total loser. No one had told me anything, yet I was supposed to know everything. Now, with my own daughter, I find it extremely embarrassing to talk about. I look back on my marriage of almost 2 decades and realize that my husband has suffered because I could never get hold of what sex should be for myself, let alone him. I'm frozen when it comes to sex. I love my husband, but can't even imagine anything positive about sex with him or anyone. If we get divorced, I would understand. Among the most religious, there is an epidemic of sexual alienation and misinformation, as we've seen in this story. Guilt in religious marriage. A married religious couple that is not having sex still has sexual energy. The sexual energy goes toward the church, the Sunday school, toward more vigorous prayer, or teaching the children. It also goes into anger and frustration, expressed as depression or unhappiness, affairs, spousal abuse, child porn, or molesting children. Even if one partner in a religious marriage is capable of turning off his or her sexual side, it is unlikely that the other is. The emotional satisfaction derived from good sex is sought in activities that are far less rewarding. As one person said about her previous religious life, "We had sex as teenagers before we got married. I didn't ever want to feel that kind of guilt again, though. So I just avoided my husband and put all my attention on the children and teaching church school. The guilt got worse as we had children.
See, that's exactly why I had an affair. Motherfucker told me he wasn't gonna give no head. Go find somebody to give me some. So when I did, the motherfucker hit the goddamn roof. But hey, you know what I told him? You better be careful coming out your mouth. I told you words, baby, words. You speak things into existence. I would never told you no shit like that. But hey, it is what a motherfucker is. You want to talk that motherfucker? Oh, you must have been out there giving him some good head. I said, no, motherfucker, I was getting some good head.
He suffered and our marriage suffered until we left the church for good. Things are much better now. It, that is, leaving the church, has renewed our entire relationship in ways I could never imagine when I was religious. Women are both powerful and powerless in many religious marriages. They are subordinate to their husbands, but have the power and obligation to control sex. Their sexual desire and gratification are seen as unimportant and maybe even evil. One minister preached, quote, "The woman is the sacred vessel into which the soul of a new infant is formed. You should always keep that in mind when loving each other," end quote. Such ideas create all kinds of barriers to sexual enjoyment and creativity, to say nothing of making a woman an object to be used for religious propagation.
That part.
With this idea, sex can never be just for enjoyment, but must always be a threesome with some god. As one wag put it, God is watching you while you're having sex,
Well, let him watch.
and maybe pleasuring himself as well. From the beginning, religious girls are taught the sacredness of sex is in childbearing, not in having fun. This is, of course, totally backwards, since a woman may have thousands of sexual encounters and orgasms for every time she conceives. To claim that reproduction is the most important part of sex goes totally against our biology. For women who do not or cannot have children, this sends an even more insidious message. You're either selfish or barren. The selfish woman then puts her own pleasure above having children for God. A barren woman, in religious terms, is often seen as being punished by some god. Being barren may also be seen as a crime or a sin against her husband. In many parts of the world, a woman who chooses not or cannot have children is treated as a second-class person. A woman who chooses not to get married is the most selfish of all. The poisoning of men and boys. While there's little doubt that women suffer the greatest oppression and restriction from religion, men are victims as well. Much of what we discussed about guilt, shame, and indirect communication applies to boys too. Many religions start with the notion that the deity is male and that therefore males are superior to women. This irrational idea informs boys' sexual map as they grow into men and breeds ideas such as the following. Women are subservient to men. Men have control over women's bodies, and men are more intelligent and closer to their God. This thinking, in turn, sets the stage for behavior that leads to abuse and conflict in relations between the sexes. For example, boys are seen as superior to adult women in many contexts. Many Baptist churches believe a woman should not be allowed to teach boys older than 12 years old. In Saudi Arabia, an adult woman must be accompanied by a male relative in public. Her 12-year-old son can accompany her. He is more adult than she is. These kinds of messages often lead boys to believe that they can act superior and intimidating toward girls. At the same time, boys receive messages about masculinity that force them to deny their sexual urges. Most adolescent boys and girls masturbate, but religion says it's forbidden. Adults preach against it, and comments are made by peers and older adolescents telling the child it is wrong and a sin. Boys make fun of one another, calling anyone who masturbates a homosexual. Real men don't masturbate. With constant messages tying masturbation to homosexuality, boys learn to
They be projecting their own insecurities. They be having homosexual thoughts.
be ashamed of their sexual urges. They often take that shame and direct it toward anyone who they believe is homosexual. I believe that most homophobia among adolescents is really intense shame about their own masturbatory behavior. Even if a boy is not necessarily religious or from a religious home, he is surrounded by a culture that perpetuates these ideas about women, masturbation, and homosexuality. I was terrified of being called a homosexual. No one admitted to masturbating, so I pretended I didn't either. I saw boys harassed unmercifully because they were somewhat effeminate. Most of all, I saw the source of these ideas coming from preachers, Sunday school teachers, camp counselors, and my grandfather, a country church minister.
Mhm.
With the rise of evangelical Christianity in the United States, Africa, South America, and other places, these messages are probably stronger today than when I was an adolescent. In a boys' locker room, it takes only one boy with foot fungus to infect a lot of others
Mhm.
if there's no preventative measures. In that same locker room, it only takes a few boys infected with religiously inspired ideas about masturbation, homosexuality, and women's inferiority to infect many other boys. The prevention is a few well-educated, assertive, and secular boys who can and will call out this behavior and stop its spread. A few students standing up to religious sexual intimidation can make a huge difference. That is why such initiatives as the It Gets Better campaign, started by Dan Savage, are so important. Giving sexual supports to students to stand up and challenge sexual bullying. Wherever religious ideas are taught, there are high levels of sex abuse, child abuse, divorce, and spouse abuse. If we wish to address the problems associated with sexual crime, abuse, and harassment, the place to start is in solid, non-religious sex education of children and adolescents. This means that religious ideas about homosexuality, masturbation, male superiority, female purity, etc., must be directly challenged.
All right, my loves. He ain't lying. He damn sure telling the truth. I hope y'all enjoy this presentation. As always, leave a comment down in the box below. Hit that thumbs up button. Share, subscribe. It always, my loves, go within, so you never go without.